Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and we've got the new iPad in today. This is the iPad Pro 10.5. It is replacing the iPad Pro 9.7 that I got last year. We're going to take a look at some size comparisons and some performance comparisons, and then talk a little bit more about what this new device brings to the mix. Now, before we get into the review, I do want to mention, in the interest of full disclosure, that I paid for this with my own funds. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, and no one is reviewing this content before it is posted. Now, what surprised me about this new iPad is that although the screen is much larger, the device itself is not much larger than the 9.7-inch device it's replacing. So here are the two stacked up next to each other. That is really the size difference here. It is not substantial at all. And what they did to make this work was that they made the bezels a lot thinner, which gave them more room to expand the screen without actually expanding the device itself. So you can see here the screen really takes up a lot more of the device as a percentage than the prior edition did. And one of the things Apple is really good at is knowing what your intent is while you're using the device. So for example, if I've got my web page up here and I'm scrolling around and I'm resting my thumb here on the screen, it knows that my thumb is not intending to press anything. It's just holding the device, and it's following along with what my finger is doing here. So they've really got their software really figured out here to get the device to follow what your intentions are, which allows them to shrink these bezels the way they do without it ruining the user experience in the process. So that's how they were able to get this device to not be all that much larger, yet give you a much larger screen, and it really does work quite well. Now, it's just slightly heavier than last year's version. It's 1.03 pounds on its own. That is about 469 grams. That compares to 0.96 pounds or 437 grams on last year's model. I also picked up the excruciatingly expensive keyboard case here. This cost another $159. The one thing about this device is that while the peripherals are very cool, they are very expensive. This does not add all that much weight to the package here, and the keys are a little larger than they were last year. Like last year, though, the keyboard tends to pop up on you a little bit here, which kind of bugs me, but generally the keyboard works as well as it did last year, and you probably will need to buy a new keyboard if you have one already for your 9.7-inch, because the keyboard is a little larger to accommodate the larger screen now. The other one does work on it, but it looks a lot better, of course, with the new one on there, so you'll probably want to consider that. It does feel a little heavier, though, when you do have the keyboard docked with it walking around, but it's still not ridiculously heavy, but it does noticeably have a little bit more weight to it. Pretty simple device overall, though. You've got nothing on this side of it beyond the little pogo plugs here for the keyboard case. On this side, there is a volume rocker, just as before. Your power switch is up here, and guess what, folks? They did not get rid of the headphone jack on the iPad Pro, so you can plug in your headphones if you wish into it, and there are no headphones included in the box, but whatever you got will work with it. Like the prior generation iPad Pros, they have 4 speakers on here, and it will dynamically change the stereo separation depending on the orientation you have the device in, so that works the same as it does before. On the bottom, you've got your Lightning connector, and this will charge the device now with fast charging. If you have one of those USB Type-C connectors, the extra charging speed comes with an additional purchase, of course. You have to buy a USB-C power adapter, but it will charge at a faster rate if you do have that adapter, and it's also now pushing data at USB 3 speeds versus USB 2 before, so they've improved that a little bit. A10X processor inside. That is a little bit of a bump from the prior generation. We'll show you some differences in performance there. The screen is at 224 by 1668 or 264 pixels per inch. That is an HDR capable display now, and it runs at 120 hertz, so it actually scrolls a lot more smoothly now than it did before. It really looks quite nice, and you can't really experience it in this video because I only shoot at 30 frames per second, but when you have it in front of you, it looks really, really nice. That compares to 2048 by 1536 on the 9.7-inch device from last year, although that one still has the same PPI as this one does. Now, like the prior generation, there are cameras on this one. There's a multi-tone flash here as well. This camera is the same camera that is in the iPhone 7, not the 7 Plus, but the 7. So it shoots 4K video. It's kind of cool to have a nice big viewfinder here to do that video shooting with. Of course, you're going to be that person holding up your iPad taking pictures with it, of course. So it'll shoot 4K at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 60 frames per second, and you can do 720p video at 240 frames per second in its slow-mo mode. So all the same features on the iPhone 7 camera are on here, including optical stabilization. I took some pictures with it outside a little earlier. Really nice detail on these things. Apple cameras have a very nice dynamic range to them. Really good stabilization on the video, too. Everything really looks great and in line with have the experience you would have on an iPhone 7. Likewise, the camera on the front here is the same too as that other device, 7 megapixels on the front. It'll shoot 1080p video, I believe, at 30 frames per second. Now, performance-wise, this one isn't all that much faster than last year's model. There are some benchmarks we'll take a look at where you can see some of the performance differences, but I think for what most people do with these devices, you're not going to notice anything on here that makes this a must-have upgrade over last year's version, unless, of course, you want the larger screen. But I did run the 3D Mark slingshot test on this iPad and also ran it on last year's model, and that test showed that the new one is faster. We got a score of 4,143 versus 3,320. Of note here is that first graphics test, significantly faster on the graphics side, at least for graphics test 1. The second graphics test, which measures a different component of the graphics subsystem, came out about even, but if you look at the CPU score here on the 3 physics tests, the new one is definitely a little faster than the old one. And while on paper it's definitely faster, when you're in apps here like iMovie, I'm editing 2 4K video files together plus a third one that's going to show up picture-in-picture there. You can see how nicely this runs. It actually runs just as nicely, at least insofar as I can perceive, on last year's version as well. So the bigger jump here again is going from the older generation hardware to this one, but less so if you're moving up from last year's version. But the display here actually is running at a faster refresh rate, which will give the impression perhaps of greater performance. So scrolling is much more smooth and even because it can update the screen so much faster, so it's less blurry as you're doing quick scrolls like this one. They've also improved the animations due to the fact they can update that display much faster. This is updated 120 times per second versus 60 times per second on last year's model. So there is an impression of greater speed here, even though the actual speed for this kind of stuff like browsing the web or working on photos or something may not actually be any different. One thing they did improve, though, is the latency of the display. In other words, how long does it take for it to register a button press or a tap of the screen with the pen? The new display here can react to a response in 44 milliseconds, which is pretty quick compared to the 100 milliseconds response from last year. So if you've been having a hard time with the pen because it doesn't feel quite right to you, this one might feel a little better. So you may want to go into an Apple store or something and try it out first. But there's probably about, at least by my measurement, about a 60 milliseconds difference in response time there. So that is pretty good. Now there are some things that the iPad Pros can do that the other iPad models can't do, and most of that involves the pencil here. So let's take a look at some of the apps that you can use with the pencil. So here's an app called Affinity Photo. This is something you might have seen on the keynote presentation that they were doing. This is kind of like a Photoshop app and seems to work pretty nicely on here. Feels a little bit more responsive perhaps than last year's iPad 9.7 does to me, but to be honest with you, if you are using either device, I think you're going to be pretty satisfied with the result here. But some pretty big improvements in software over last year's offerings for the pencil here, especially this app in particular. Really cool stuff that you can do with it and getting close to, or perhaps in some ways exceeding what you can do on a desktop just because you've got a very responsive pen here that makes a big difference. I'm going to pop into something called Procreate here. This is another one we looked at last year. There's really no difference in what you can do with the new iPad, just that you've got a larger screen to work with now, and the pen feels maybe a little more natural, a little bit more responsive. You can see there's not much of a trail here behind my pen as I draw with it. So I'm noticing just slight differences in latency on the new one here, which probably translates out to what I was noticing when I was running my test with it earlier. And the good news is last year's pen still works with this year's iPad. So $100 for the pen, it's quite a bit, but if you are doing a lot of artwork, I think you'll like this, especially having a device that's about the same size as last year, but with a larger screen to work with. And that larger screen will help with things like multitasking and split screen view here. So one of the features of the more recent iOS updates that you can have 2 things running at the same time, like I've got Twitter and my web browser here running, and there's just more room now to have both on here. It's a little more practical now than it may have been last year on the 9.7. There's also more RAM on this device. There's 4 gigabytes of RAM versus 2 on the old one. So I think as apps get more advanced, you'll be able to do more at the same time, although I never really had an issue with the 2 gigs of RAM that were on the original. Now, like all iPads, the battery life on this thing is excellent. I got this one in earlier this morning. I've been really killing it all day. It only came in with about 75% of a charge. I still have about 30% in the tank here. This thing just keeps going and going, just like my old one did. In fact, my old one I maybe charge up once or twice a week, if that. I don't think I've ever killed the battery on it. So these things really do quite well, especially if you're just browsing the web and watching videos and doing some light work on it. They really will get you through well more than a day of usage, especially if you're using it intermittently throughout the week. So really good stuff there. Now, I've got this article up here from The Verge. They call it overkill, and I could not agree more. This thing is really perfect in the sense that it does everything that it sets out to do perfectly. It is elegant. It is a luxury device without question. Probably the nicest display you will ever see on a mobile device, at least until the next one comes out. And it is just supremely well executed across the board. But you're going to pay a huge price premium for this. This starts at $649 for the 64 gigabyte version. And as these apps get more advanced, that may not be enough storage. So they have now entered into a new structure of their storage capacity. So you go from 64 at $649 to 256 at $749. What's an extra $100? That's what I did. I was doing the calculation. I really wanted 128, but 256 was where I needed to go with it. There's no SD card slot on these things, so the storage you buy is the storage you will have forever. There is also a 512 gigabyte version for $949. These are the Wi-Fi models. They also have one with a cellular modem on board, a 4G modem. That one goes up to $1,079 for the 512 gig configuration. This one with that 4G modem is $879. So very expensive, but you're not done spending yet because you need to get the Apple Care on this stuff because it has a 1-year warranty, but if something were to break on this thing, it's going to be very difficult and very expensive to get it repaired. That does give you a discount if you break the screen, so there is some advantages to it that way if you're clumsy or something, but by and large, you're going to need to get that just because you don't want to be stuck paying a huge replacement fee a year and a half out. The other thing you may want to get is the keyboard case, which will set you back $150. It is very elegant here and really nicely compact, and it really is quite nice to type on. I reviewed the one from last year's iPad, which I'll put down below in the video description so you can check out how it works. But a really nice keyboard, but $150. And if you want the pencil, there's another $100 here. So the bottom line is by the time you're done, you're easily going to be spending $1,000 on this thing, which is really what you would spend typically on a PC, which is why Apple is now marketing these things as PC replacements. Is it a PC replacement? It might be for some people, but I think for a lot of folks, myself included, there are still things that I prefer doing on a computer, and I do often need a mouse, which this thing doesn't really do. So there's some areas here where it just isn't quite a PC replacement for me, but you might know somebody who is looking for one. That said, the one from last year, the 9.7 Pro and the 12-inch Pro that was just updated to some of the features that are now in the 10.5 are still very relevant and very usable, and you could probably find them at a good price. And if you can get last year's model, jump on it because you're going to get everything you're seeing here. In the case of the 9.7, a slightly smaller screen, but the performance for what you're going to do with it will be about the same. Really nice tablet, the best in the business last year. This one is better, but still far beyond competitors out there. And I think if you are looking for one of these things and want to spend less, you're not going to lose all that much by going with last year's version. So the best of the best here if you want to pay for it. And I am quite pleased with it, but I don't know if everyone needs one of these things in their repertoire. There are, of course, other iPads that don't perform as well as this one does that will probably get the job done for a lot of folks. But if you really want the best, this one is definitely it, and I am quite pleased with it. This is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by my Patreon supporters, including gold level supporters Mark Bollinger and Cody Falk. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/Patreon to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/S.